Brad, there is a certain sister in this congregation trying to get a hold of you the other day to let you know that she is very fond of that song that we just sang, so you might want to talk to her and find out what the change of heart is. Good to see you today. Appreciate the presence of all who have chosen to visit with us. I want to say a word. Many of you have asked me about the condition of Mom. Mom went to her hematologist on Friday, and they have determined as a result of much blood work that she's had done that she probably is going to be diagnosed with multiple myeloma. There's still an outside chance that that'll not be the case, and they said that the other option is a blood disorder. And as a matter of fact, it's the same blood disorder that she had a brother who died from a few years ago, but they think that that what she has is multiple myeloma, and she's scheduled for a bone marrow test on the 22nd. I certainly just appreciate your prayers for her, and also remember Erin, the niece of Shannon, that was indicated that has really taken a turn for the worse, and we need to keep her in our thoughts and in our prayers as well. I guess Tim did get her going. Appreciate that. In the passage that we had read for us from the 12th chapter of the book of Mark, it's kind of very interesting because this has been late in the ministry of Jesus when a scribe came to Jesus. Now, scribe is the word scribe is translated from a Greek word grammaticus. It's the same word from which we get the word grammar. And a scribe would have been someone who transcribed or copied. He was a copyist of the law, and so he would have taken time to write the law into copies. Didn't have people who are able to make copies like we do on Xerox machines or anything like that. They had to do all of this by hand, as we certainly understand. But this copyist, who would have been familiar with the law of Moses, came to Jesus with a question. Now, he came to Jesus with a question after Jesus had been questioned, number one, by the Herodians, a sect of the Jews who wanted to know, was it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, Jesus silenced them by pointing out that you render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and you render to God what belongs to God. Then the Sadducees, another sect of the Jews, came to Jesus with a question, and it had to do with the resurrection. If you say there's a resurrection, and here's a woman who had 7 husbands, who is she going to be married to in the resurrection? And Jesus silenced them. He said, your problem is twofold. You don't know the Scriptures nor the power of God. So after this, after he dealt with the Herodians and after he dealt with the Sadducees, then the scribe came to Jesus and he had a question for Jesus. He wanted to know, now, which is the first commandment of all? Now, that's the way the New King James Version translates his question. Now, he wasn't asking, which law or which command God gave first. That's not what he's asking. He's not asking which is the first of the 10 commandments. That's not the question that he wants to know. He doesn't want to know which was the first law outside the 10 commandments that God gave. You see, the Jewish scholars had taken all of the Old Testament and they had reduced it down to 613 commands. And so many of them thought that the commands to do with burnt offerings was the greatest command, or was the first command. Which one is the first commandment of all? What should we do? Where should we place our priorities? So he's not asking the question which command was number one. I think the New English Bible helps us to understand that. He was wanting to know which commandment is the most important of all. Isn't that an interesting question? I think that it is. Which commandment is the most important of all? Hey, and I got to tell you something. I want you to stop and think about this. Because the answer that we're going to look at in a moment, the answer that Jesus gives to this question, ought to strike terror in the heart of every one of us. The answer that Jesus gives to this question ought to be something that causes us to do some serious internal examinations. Because I want to tell you how Jesus didn't answer this question. Jesus didn't say to this man, when he asked which is the most important commandment that God had given, he didn't say, listen, what you need to do is make your worship to God a priority. He didn't say that. Now don't misunderstand me, worship is important. We need to worship God because that displays and demonstrates our love for God. But He didn't say, make worship your priority. That is the number one commandment, or the most important commandment that was given by God. You see, worship has always been a part of the human existence, a part of the human experience since the days of Adam and Eve. You remember, we look in Acts chapter 17, when Paul went to Mars Hill, he said to them, I perceive that you are very religious. Here were religious people. Now, they were religiously wrong, but here were religious people who were worshiping in verses 23 and 24 of Acts 17. And so while worship is important, that's not the answer that Jesus gives. Furthermore, Jesus did not say to this scribe who asked him a question, He didn't say, well, now you just do a lot of holy things and you just be, real active in your deeds that you do. He didn't say that. He didn't say that at all. He didn't say, hey, listen, what you need to do is spend the rest of your life just doing holy things. There are many good deeds that we can do. That doesn't make us loyal to God. You take in Acts chapter 10 and verse 2, Cornelius was a man who was full of good deeds. He gave alms to the people generously. And so there have been people down throughout time that did a lot of holy things. Now Jesus didn't say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to start worshiping God. He didn't say that. He didn't say, I want you to start doing good deeds. He didn't say that. And He didn't say, I want you to be a good person. He didn't say, now all of these things are important, but those are not the answers that Jesus gives. There are a lot of good people. You read in 2 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 27, a man by the name of Ahamiz, he was a good man. The Bible says that he was. There are a lot of good people. The neighborhood I live in, there are a lot of good people. I've got a good neighbor. And I'm serious about that. Probably one of the best neighbors I've ever had. And many of my neighbors are that way. And there are a lot of good people who pay their taxes and support their families and obey the laws of the land. They're good people. Jesus didn't say to this man who asked him a question, what is the greatest commandment? What is the most important commandment from God? He didn't say worship God. Now we need to worship. He didn't say do good deeds. Now we should do good deeds. And He didn't say be a good person. Now we should be good people. But that's not the answer that Jesus gave. Notice the answer that Jesus gave. He said, well, you shall love the Lord your God. You want to know what's number one? You love the Lord your God with all. That's what I've called this sermon, with all. You love the Lord your God with all your heart. You love the Lord your God with all your soul. And you love the Lord your God with all your mind. And you love the Lord your God with all your strength. That is number one. That is the most important command that God has ever given. But I want you to notice, He uses that term with all 4 times. He doesn't use it just to modify those 4 things. He uses that term 4 times. He uses with all, which translates ek holos, which is an interesting set of Greek words because it means out. Ek is out. It means out of the whole. You love God out of the whole, out of the complete, out of the entire. Our love for God must be with all. Not part. No, we're interested in Him. We must love God with all. Our heart, soul, mind, and strength, with every aspect of our emotion, with every part of our life, with our intellect, and with all of our energy. Now that's what God said. And that's why I said it ought to strike terror in each of us. Because if that's not what we're doing, then no matter what else we're doing, whether it's worshiping God or doing good deeds or just being good people, it is all futile. Isn't that what Paul said? Paul indicated as much, did he not? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, listen to it. He said, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, well, he said, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries, and have all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, he said, I am nothing. And he said, though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, he said, it profits me nothing. You see how important it is? This is why Jesus said this is the number one command that God has given. You love God with all of your emotion, with all of your life, with all of your intellect, and with every ounce of your energy. But now let me ask you something. Does God really have the right to demand that of us? Does God have the right to say to you and to me that you must love me with every part of your being? That is number one. Does he have the right to say that? You remember 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, the Bible says that God is love. And then when I consider that we're to love God with the total person, when I consider that God is love, I have to consider what he did to express that. John 3 and verse 16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Looking at the love of God, Paul said in Romans 5 and verse 8, he demonstrated it by sending his Son. And then in 1 John chapter 4, in this the love of God was manifested toward us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world. You know, I got to tell you, you look at what God has done. God has loved us with all. God has not withheld from us one iota of his love. God has loved us with all. And that's why God has the right to say to us, you love me with all. With all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Because that's what God has done for us. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19, we love him because he first loved us. So what I want us to do is I want us to take time to examine each one of these four things that God said we must love him with all. Now I'm not going to take them in necessary order that they're given. But we're going to look at each one of them and make some applications. And let's start with loving the Lord with all your mind. Now that's an interesting thing because Jesus is actually here quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, which to the Jewish mind is referred to as the Shema. And when Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5, he adds something to what Moses said. And the thing that he adds to what Moses said is this very first point that we're looking at. This is not found in the Shema, but Jesus adds it. Moses didn't say to the Jews that you're to love God with all of your mind, but Jesus added that, and he said that we are to love God with all of our mind. Now just think about that for a moment, because we're talking about the intellect. We're talking about the thinking part of men and women. And a lot of people, seem to believe that Christians don't think. That we're just superstitious people. That we're just acting, upon blind faith. But Jesus said we're to love God with all of the reasoning ability that we have. We're to love God with every ounce of our mind, with our intellect. This is the same thing that Paul was talking about in Romans 12 and verse 2. When he says that we are to devote ourselves to doing the will of God, which is our reasonable service. He's not saying that it's more reasonable to serve God than not. He said you serve God with that with which you reason. With the mind. You love God with all your mind. Ladies and gentlemen, the mind is that with which we make important decisions. You're not going to be able to figure your taxes without using the mind. You're not going to be able to send your children to school without utilizing the mind. You're not going to be able to drive a car or to make any kind of transaction without using your mind. Now what God is saying here is, I want you to love me with all your mind. I want you to be devoted to me with all of your mind, with all of your intellect, and with all of your understanding. Now how many of us, let's be serious about this, how many of us truly, genuinely love God with all of our mind? You know, I'm going to talk about heart here. We're going to look at that in a moment. Jesus uses heart and mind separately here. Now, how many of us actually love God with all of our mind? Now, there's two things that we need to think about when we talk about loving God with all of our mind. Number one, if we do love God with all of our mind, we're busy every single day filling our mind with His Word. Let the words of Christ dwell in you richly, Colossians 3 and verse 16. Now, when I go several days without studying the Bible, if I can go several days without letting God speak to me in my mind through His Word, then I am a sham. I don't love God with all of my mind. Let the words of Christ dwell in you richly. Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15 that it's through this, through our letting the words of Christ dwell in us, that we're brought to the Lord. That makes us wise unto salvation. Now, if I'm not studying the Bible, if I'm not, bringing that Word into my mind, and I tell you, I'm not going to be wise to salvation. I'm going to be a fool serving the devil. And so that's why Paul said to Timothy, study or be diligent to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. Now I ask you again, do we really love God with all of our mind if I'm not studying the Bible? If the only time that I open my Bible is when I'm in a Bible class, and then my mind is drifting somewhere else. I am to love God with all of my mind. You know, a man said one time, he said, the more I get to know people, the more I love my dog. You might think, what are you talking about? Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. The more you get to know God by looking into the mirror of His Word, the more, and you will get to know yourself by looking into the mirror of God's Word. The more you get to know God and the more you get to know yourself, the more you will love God. Because you recognize that I am a sinner in need of salvation. I am a sinner in a hopeless condition. But if I'm not in the Word, I'm not reading that Word, and I'm not implanting that Word in my mind, then I'm not going to seek salvation. That's where it starts. Love God with all of your mind. And that's going to be displayed in the way that I fill my mind with His Word. But in the second place, it means that I'm going to intelligently make right decisions. How many times do you hear Christians involving themselves in sin? You hear a Christian say, I just made a mistake. I wasn't thinking. Well, if you love God with all of your mind, you will begin to think right. And you'll begin to act upon what you're thinking. Well, I just didn't think. Well, Jesus said, hey, I want your thinker to be focused upon me. I want you to be loving me with all your mind. And then you begin to act upon the knowledge that you have. Now, knowledge alone, 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 1, leads to arrogance. Paul said it puffs up. If that's all we have. But it's got to lead to something else. If I have knowledge and I love God with all of my mind, then I'm going to start making right decisions. It's just like this. It's just like a young girl that I read about. She and some other teenagers, they were at a party. And it was an okay party. And then her date and some others, they began to talk about, hey, listen, here's where we need to go. Man, they're really having a party over here, and we really need to go over there and leave this old boring party. And this girl said, no, I'm not going. She told her date, I want you to take me home. Now, here's somebody who loves the Lord with all of her mind. She said, I don't want to go over there because my parents would not be approving of me going over there. And one of her girlfriends spoke up and said, well, what, are you afraid to go over there? You afraid you're going to go home and your dad's going to hurt you? And she said, no. I'm not afraid that my dad would hurt me, but I am afraid that if my dad found out that I was there, it would hurt him. Now here's somebody who loves with her mind. And as a result of that, she's making right decisions. Love the Lord with all of your mind. That's 1/4 of the equation. Then he says we're to love the Lord with all of our heart. How many times do we talk about the heart being, the Bible heart being the mind? And in many instances it is. We talk about the mind, we talk about the heart. There's no question about that. But in this instance, it's got to be different because Jesus uses it differently here. Here he's referring to our emotions. It's like what Paul said in Acts 21 and verse 13 to the elders at Ephesus. He said, you're breaking my heart. You're breaking my heart. And it's talking about the emotions. Now, I realize and I understand that many New Testament Christians are absolutely terrified to talk about loving God with an emotion. I think sometimes we're afraid of being categorized with, if we display any emotion, we're being categorized with these people that are given to emotionalism. Or we think that's denominational. To love God with an emotion. Really? When I think about our Lord, just think about Jesus for a moment. Was Jesus an emotionless character? Was he just robotic? Did he just go through life without any kind of emotion, without being touched? No, absolutely not. John 11 verse 35. Jesus wept. There were tears that stained his face. As a matter of fact, in Acts 23 and verse 37, Jesus overlooking the city of Jerusalem was so moved that he said, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you stone the prophets, you kill the prophets and you stone them that are sent to you. How often would I have gathered you to myself as a chicken gathers her, as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would? Jesus was weeping over the city of Jerusalem. Jesus had emotion. And then there's in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 and 41, when a leper came to Jesus and asked Jesus to cleanse him. Did you ever notice that leprosy is the only disease in the Bible that calls for a cleansing rather than a healing? I find that to be extremely interesting, and there are thoughts and lessons from that we ought to learn. But here was a man who wanted Jesus, if you will, you can make me clean. Jesus was moved with compassion, and he touched the man. How long had it been since that man felt the human touch? Jesus had emotion. And we're to love the Lord with all of our emotion. I'm not talking about emotionalism. I'm talking about with all of the emotion that we have. And I'm going to tell you, until our hearts are broken, until we become ashamed, and that involves the emotion, we will never seek a cleansing from the Lord. It'll never happen. Until our hearts are broken, until our hearts are touched with the love of God, we will never make amends in our lives. We may know all of these things, but until they're able to reach in and touch our emotions, we're going to remain just that, robotic in our response to God. And I see it. I see it. I preach to people all across the country. And I see people sitting there with a robotic look on their face. They know what I'm talking about. They've heard it 1,000 times before. And they just sit there emotionless. And if the Scriptures doesn't touch the chords of my heart, the chords of my emotion, I will never be drawn to it. Never. I'll never be penitent. I think of David. When David was rebuked by Nathan for his sin with Bathsheba, did David know his adultery was wrong? Yes. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was wrong going into it. But see, something happened when Nathan came to him. David's heart was then broken. He got his emotions involved. And that's why he said in Psalm 21 and verse 10 to God, create within me a clean heart, O God. I need a cleansing. But that cleansing is only going to come when we allow our hearts to be touched and broken. When When is actually, honestly, when's the last time that the story of the cross ever brought a tear to your eye? We had 4 men standing up here talking about the cross this morning. As we observe the Lord's Supper, how many times does that ever cause us to get a lump in our throat and a tear in our eye? Man and woman were atheists. They had a 12 or 13-year-old son that they decided we're going to try to expose him to all the superstition that's in the religious world. So they got his nanny to take him to church one time, just so he could observe the superstition among the Christians. And the preacher that day happened to be preaching on the crucifixion of Christ. And he talked about the scourging, and he talked about the beatings, and he talked about the carrying the cross to the place of Golgotha, and he talked about the nails that were driven in the master's hands. And this little boy was listening riveted to the words of that preacher. And he got up right on the edge of his chair, and he just got so caught up in what the preacher was saying. He said, "Somebody help that man." I'm talking about Jesus. Somebody help him. And his nanny looked down at him and said, "Shh, you better hush." She said, "It's just a story. And you're going to feel a lot differently when you go home. You'll forget all about it." Is that a microcosm of the thinking of a lot of people who attend church on a regular basis? It's just a story. I've heard it 1,000 times. It doesn't reach in and touch my heart. It doesn't bring a tear to my eye. There is no emotion. And somebody that has an attitude like that will never. Someone who doesn't love the Lord with all of their emotion, with all of their heart, will never forsake all and follow Him, as He says in Luke 14 and verse 33. You know how I know that? I'll tell you how I know that. You can't have motion without emotion. You can't have motion without emotion. And if there's not some emotion, then we're not going to do. And we're not going to be moved. I'll tell you what, the church today needs some emotion. If you can get people emotionally involved, I'm going to tell you something, that's going to change people. They're going to get busy doing. Listen to what occurred in the 24th chapter of the book of Luke. When Jesus appeared to the two on the road to Emmaus, revealed Himself to them. Here's what one of them's response was in verse 32. "Did not our heart burn within us while He talked with us on the way, or on the road? While He opened the Scriptures to us, didn't our hearts burn?" He got to their emotions. And you look at the very next verse, and they rose up that very hour, and they went all the way back to Jerusalem, several furlongs. You can't have motion without emotion. And the reason you got a lot of lifeless people is because they haven't begun to love the Lord. Not just with all their mind, but with all their heart. That's half. Let's look at 3/4. Love the Lord with all your strength, is what Jesus also said. Love the Lord with all your strength, with all of your energy, with every part of your being. You know, I got to tell you something. If the Lord is loved with all of our strength, and we love the Lord with all of our emotion, then I'm going to tell you something, it's going to be expressed in our action. Christianity is a doing religion. Did you know that? It's a doing religion. It's something that we do, not just something we retain. It's something that we do. Not everyone that says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he what? Matthew 7 and verse 21, "He who does the will of my Father." These are the ones that's going to heaven. So you love the Lord with all of your strength, with all of your energy, with all of your doing. James 1 and verse 22, "Be doers of the word and not mere hearers only. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord." 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. This describes where we need to be as God's people. This is not a sitting religion. Christianity is not a sitting religion. You remember reading in Matthew 27 and verse 36 when Jesus was hanging on the cross? The Bible says they sitting watched him there. I tell you, that's always been a frightening passage to me. Here were people just sitting and watching. Just sitting and watching. And Christianity is not a sitting and watching religion. But you know what's happening? What's happening in a lot of places is, well, we just sit and watch the preacher. We just sit and watch the song leader. We just sit and watch the Bible class teacher. We just sit and watch our neighbors as they're going to hell. We just sit and watch. That's not loving the Lord with all of our strength. Loving the Lord with all of our strength means that we're going to give to Him every ounce of our being. It means that we're going to give Him the very best of our time, the very best of our money, the very best of our talents, and the very best of our energy. We're not going to toss God some leftovers. We love Him with all of our strength. You see why this is a frightening passage? You see why this ought to strike terror? Love the Lord with all your mind, with all your heart, and with all your strength. You see, love expressed by strength and guided by intellect and motivated by emotions is what God is interested in. That's only 3/4. He says that we're to love Him with all of our soul. J.R., how can you do that? How can you love God with all of your soul? And the reason we ask that is because soul very often is used synonymously with the spirit. With that part of man or that part of woman that's going to be eternal and live on in His presence. But you know, and a lot of times the word soul in the Scriptures does refer to our spirit. That which is made in the likeness of God. That which goes back to God upon death. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. Very often soul is used that way. You know, Jesus used it that way, and that word translates psyche. Soul is translated psyche. By the way, that's the same word from which we get the word psychiatrist or psychologist, which is interesting in and of itself. But that word is sometimes used in reference to the eternal part of man, the spirit of man, the inner man. Jesus used it that way in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. He says, fear Him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. It's used that way in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26. What would a man give in exchange for his soul? That's talking about the eternal part of man. But that's not the way that the word is always translated. Psyche is sometimes referring to life. I know that sometimes that's kind of difficult for us to recognize, but in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25, Jesus said, what is your life? Don't worry about your life. That's the word psyche. Don't worry about life. He's talking about life, our existence. Life upon this earth. And so you see, to love God with all of our souls is to love God with all of our life. With every ounce of being that we have, give ourselves over to Him completely and entirely to the Lord. That's what it means to love Him with all of our soul, with all of our life. Put God before and above anything in this life. It means that I'm willing to sacrifice my life for Him if that becomes necessary. You see, this is how God demonstrated His love for us. Jesus asked the question in Matthew 20 and verse 28, or Jesus made the statement about Himself that the Son of Man came to give Himself as a ransom and to give His life, psyche, for many. He's talking about His life upon this earth. So if I love God with all of my soul, I love God with all of my life. He is the center and the heart of my life, my existence. It's the old hymn sometimes that we sing, when I survey the wondrous cross. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, and my all. What's the greatest commandment? Love God with your all. With all of your heart, all of your mind, with all of your strength, and with all of your soul. Now, let me illustrate it to you this way. You know, we talk about being laborers in the vineyard. Yeah, and we should be. There's no question about that. But I'm going to show you the difference right now between a laborer, a craftsman, and an artist, and a Christian. Now, while we as Christians need to be laborers, we need to be craftsmen, and we need to be artists. But it goes way beyond that. Because you see, a laborer uses his hands. And he does what he's told. He uses his hands. A craftsman uses his hands, but he also uses his head. He has to design. He has to create. An artist will use his hands, and he will use his head, and he will use his heart to interpret a scene. A Christian has got to go beyond being a laborer. He's got to go beyond being a craftsman and even beyond being an artist. Because according to the words of Jesus, a Christian uses his hands, his head, and his heart, and his life for God. Now let me ask you, this morning as we close out our thoughts, do you love God with all of your mind, with all of your heart, with all of your strength, and with all of your soul? Do you? If you do, then I'm going to tell you something. It's going to be evident in the life that you live, without question, without reservation. But if not, now's the time for you to make a decision. Things are going to be different from this point forward. I'm going to avail myself to the first and the greatest commandment that God has ever given. And I'm going to love Him with all of my heart, with all of my mind, with all of my strength, and with all of my soul. And I'm going to let that be known today as I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, as I repent of my sins, turn from them, and confess my faith in Him, be baptized into Him for the remission of my sins. And God, this is the first day of the rest of my life when I promise you that I'm going to love you with all of my mind, with all of my heart, with all of my strength, and with all of my soul. And I'm going to let that be known right now. Would you? Would you come as together we stand and as we sing?